Hello and welcome to Research Methods in Cognitive Aging. So, today I'm just going to talk about two different types of studies, how they work, what are the benefits of them, what are the downsides of them, and just discuss how it is that we like to do studies in aging. So, first is a cross-sectional study. In a cross-sectional study, what you do is you measure younger adults of today versus older adults of today. So basically, it happens at one time point. So you'll go into the lab and you'll study 18 to 22-year-olds usually. A lot of times we use college samples. And older adults, usually individuals who are retired, and we look at differences in cognitive ability. And that'd be a cross-sectional study. Whereas a longitudinal study, what you would do is you would follow an individual throughout their life and see changes in their cognition. So what are the different pros and cons of each? So for a cross-sectional study, what's so nice about it is that it's quick and easy. So for researchers, a lot of times we're under pressure to publish papers, to put new ideas out there into the world and to further science. And as a result, we want to do this kind of at a faster pace. And when it comes to a cross-sectional study, it's pretty quick. So, for instance, we could get a study done in less than a year when we're doing a cross-sectional study. Whereas for a longitudinal study, it would take way longer because we'd be following people throughout their lives, and your entire career would be based on essentially one paper. So another thing is that they're relatively cheap. A lot of times you just need to bring people into the lab one time and maybe, either give them extra credit if they're younger adults that are students, and if they're older adults, maybe give them $20 or something. And what it does is it gives you a snapshot. It lets you know how things are going at that very moment. And that could be very helpful, seeing age-related differences between younger and older adults. And note that I say age-related differences and not changes. So when we study older and younger adults in a cross-sectional framework, meaning that there's two separate groups, basically we can only see what are the differences right now between younger adults and older adults. But we're not able to see changes necessarily because we don't watch them develop. So what are some of the big cons of cross-sectional research? Well, definitely that we're not able to see the changes is a pretty big deal. Because a lot of times when we're interested in aging, we're interested to see what are the differences, what happens throughout our lifespan to make us change is really kind of the major questions that we ask. And another con is that cohort effects can get in the way. So cohort is just another name for group. So group effects, some of the classic examples are, do major life events change the way that we develop and the way that we see the world? And in general, evidence seems to say yes. So people that were born during the Great Depression might be qualitatively different than those that weren't, and children that are growing up during a pandemic like COVID-19, they might develop slightly differently than those that don't, because more time on the computer, which could be good, but then also maybe a little bit less socialization, which could be bad. So those are the things that you need to consider when you're thinking about cohort effects. And lots of cohort effects are found around technology with today's older adults who weren't born with it relative to the younger adults that were born with it today. So that's a little look into cross-sectional studies. Whereas longitudinal studies, you are able to look at age changes. You're able to look at within person change, meaning you get to look at an individual and see what are the changes within that person. And ultimately, for most research questions, that's very much the goal, to look at changes within the individual. So with the Seattle longitudinal study, which is probably the most famous and well-researched study of all time, it started off as a dissertation that just lasted, it's probably at least 50 years old by now. And what they found was that depending on your methodology, whether you're using a cross-sectional or a longitudinal study, it can show different results. So that's why methodology is so important. So early cross-sectional studies showed that there were age-related differences in cognitive performance at a younger age than the longitudinal studies showed. So basically, they were looking at younger adults at the time and older adults at the time. And what they were finding was older adults weren't doing so well at a younger age. But when we looked at changes in the individual over time, the declines actually started to happen later in life. And the reason why this was thought to be found was something that's called the Flynn effect. And the Flynn effect is this idea that humans, at least for a certain period of time, their IQ is increasing, they're becoming smarter. So when you test younger adults of today versus older adults, it makes it seem like older adults are getting a lot worse, but in reality, younger adults are just fairly smart. And that was the reason why that was happening. So that's another example of cohort effects getting in the way. So taking a longitudinal study was critical to understanding changes within the individual over time, because the cross-sectional study didn't really work because the younger adults were just smarter than the older adults were, probably even when they were younger adults. Okay, so what are some of the cons of a longitudinal study? Well, it's really time consuming, like I was saying. Basically, it takes years and years and years to complete, and it's very expensive. It costs a lot of money to bring people back to the lab year in and year out. And also there's some methodological things to worry about. For instance, practice effects. So if you're trying to study different cognitive processes and you're using the same test every single time they come into the lab, there's a chance that just by practice, they'll get better at those different tests. So that's one thing to consider, but this is really just meant to be an introduction. There's a lot you can dive into with the methodology, and I think it's good to just leave it here. Just basically realize that cross-sectional studies are good for taking a snapshot. It can show age-related differences, but not changes. And longitudinal studies can actually show changes within the individual. So there have been a few different really famous longitudinal studies. The Berlin Aging Study is one of them, but the Seattle Longitudinal Study is the one that I'm talking about now, and some of the findings they have are very much in line with what we see from research today in cognitive aging. So how are we going to go about reducing cognitive decline? Well, absence of cardiovascular disease is a good sign. Having high socioeconomic status, so high levels of education and earning well, is important. Intellectually stimulating environment, so make sure you're challenging yourself. High cognitive status of a spouse, that was pretty interesting. I don't think we've seen that yet, which is basically like you're being challenged and you're able to engage in life with a spouse is something that's important. And also high levels of perceptual processing. So this goes in line with some of the common cause theories. So Shine Baltus showed that sensory processing is super important, and Salthouse showed that speed of processing is super important, so it kind of falls in line with that. So yeah, there's a basic overview of cross-sectional and longitudinal studies in aging. I hope that you enjoyed listening, and I look forward to seeing any comments you might have. Have a great day.